The radio crackled with static as Major General William Tunner stared at the map spread across his desk. Red circles marked the positions of 500 American soldiers trapped behind enemy lines in the mountains of Burma. The monsoon season had turned landing strips into mud pools. No male pilot had successfully navigated the treacherous hump route over the Himalayas in these conditions for 3 days. Supplies were running dangerously low, and time was slipping away like sand through his fingers. Then came the voice that would change military aviation forever. "Sir, we volunteer for the mission." Tunner looked up to see 3 figures standing in his doorway. They wore the same flight jackets as his best pilots, carried the same determined expression, but there was one crucial difference that made every man in the room fall silent. They were women. This is the untold story of how the most dangerous rescue mission in World War II history wasn't completed by the celebrated male aces or decorated squadron leaders. Instead, it was accomplished by a group of women who weren't even officially allowed to fly in combat zones. Their names were erased from official reports, their contributions buried under decades of military secrecy, and their heroism nearly forgotten by history. But the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it involves the kind of courage that defies every rule, breaks every barrier, and saves every life that matters. This is that truth. The year was 1943, and the world was burning. In the steamy jungles of Southeast Asia, American forces were fighting a war that seemed impossible to win. The Japanese had cut off supply lines, destroyed airfields, and turned every mountain pass into a death trap, but nowhere was the situation more desperate than in the remote valleys of Burma, where 500 American soldiers found themselves completely isolated from the rest of their forces. Captain Sarah Mitchell had been washing her flight suit in a bucket of cold water when the emergency call came through. The daughter of a Kansas wheat farmer, she had learned to fly in her father's crop duster when she was just 16 years old. Her hands moved with the same confident precision whether she was steering a plane through turbulence or mending a torn engine cable with nothing but wire and determination. The military brass had initially rejected her application to join the Army Air Forces 3 times, citing regulations that prohibited women from flying in combat zones. They had grudgingly accepted her into the Women Air Force Service Pilots program only after the war had claimed so many male pilots that they were running out of options. Standing beside her at the briefing table was Lieutenant Nancy Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American whose grandfather had helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. Nancy possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate through impossible weather conditions, reading wind patterns and storm systems the way other people read newspapers. She had grown up in San Francisco, watching merchant ships disappear into fog banks so thick they seemed solid. Her training as a meteorologist had taught her to see patterns that others missed, to find safe passage through conditions that would ground experienced pilots. The third member of their unofficial team was Flight Officer Maria Gonzalez, whose father had been a mechanic for Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution. Maria could coax performance from damaged aircraft that bordered on miraculous. She understood engines the way musicians understand instruments, hearing problems in the subtle changes of engine rhythm that others would miss entirely. Her mechanical intuition had saved dozens of planes and pilots, though her contributions were rarely mentioned in official reports. The 3 women had met during training at Avenger Field in Texas, where they had quickly discovered they shared something beyond their love of flying. They all possessed a stubborn refusal to accept limitations that others tried to impose on them. While their male counterparts often flew with bravado and aggression, these women had developed a more calculated approach to danger, understanding that survival often depended on patience and precision rather than raw courage. Major General Tunner had earned his reputation by solving impossible logistical challenges. He was the architect of the Berlin airlift strategy and the man responsible for keeping Allied forces supplied across the most dangerous air routes in the world. But the situation in Burma had pushed even his considerable abilities to their limits. The monsoon season had turned the Himalayan air corridors into a maze of violent storms, unpredictable wind shears, and visibility so poor that instruments became useless. 3 supply missions had already failed, and each failure meant that the trapped soldiers were closer to running out of food, medicine, and ammunition. The military commanders gathered around Tunner's map table represented decades of combat experience. Colonel James Harrison had flown bombing missions over Germany and earned 2 distinguished flying crosses for his heroism. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Zhang had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor and led fighter squadrons across the Pacific Theater. Captain David Thompson had completed more supply runs over the hump than any other pilot in his squadron. These were men who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious, but even they were shaking their heads at the impossibility of the Burma mission. The weather reports painted a picture of atmospheric chaos. Wind speeds were exceeding 80 miles per hour at cruising altitude. Cloud formations were stacked from ground level to 25,000 feet, creating a vertical maze of turbulence and ice. Lightning strikes were occurring every few minutes, and the electrical activity was intense enough to damage aircraft systems. Radio communication would be impossible for long stretches of the flight, meaning that pilots would be navigating blind through some of the most treacherous airspace in the world. Sarah had been studying the weather charts for hours, tracing potential flight paths with her finger and calculating fuel consumption rates in her head. She understood better than most that this wasn't simply a matter of flying through bad weather. The mission required threading a needle through a constantly shifting pattern of storms while carrying enough supplies to make the journey worthwhile. The aircraft would be operating at maximum weight capacity, which would reduce their maneuverability and increase their vulnerability to wind shear. Nancy was analyzing meteorological data from weather stations scattered across the region, looking for patterns that might indicate brief windows of improved conditions. Her training had taught her that even the most violent storm systems contain moments of relative calm, brief opportunities when an experienced pilot might be able to slip through defenses that would destroy anyone attempting a direct assault. She was searching for those moments, mapping them against the flight time requirements for the mission. Maria was examining technical specifications for the C-47 cargo planes that would be used for the mission. These aircraft were reliable workhorses, but they weren't designed for the kind of punishment they would face over the Himalayas. She was calculating engine performance under extreme conditions, identifying potential failure points, and developing contingency plans for mechanical problems that might occur during flight. Her analysis suggested that standard maintenance procedures would be insufficient for aircraft operating under such stress. The three women had spent countless hours discussing the tactical challenges of flying in combat zones, despite their official exclusion from such missions. They had studied after-action reports, analyzed successful and failed operations, and developed theories about optimal approaches to dangerous situations. Their conversations had been theoretical until now, but the Burma crisis was forcing everyone to reconsider what was theoretical and what was practical. General Tunner was facing a decision that would define his career and potentially determine the fate of 500 soldiers. Every conventional approach to the rescue mission had been evaluated and found inadequate. His most experienced pilots had concluded that the mission was too dangerous to attempt under current conditions. Weather forecasts suggested that conditions might not improve for weeks, and the trapped soldiers didn't have weeks to wait. Sarah stepped forward from the group of observers who had gathered at the edge of the briefing room. Her voice was steady and clear as she addressed the general directly, ignoring the surprised expressions of the male officers around the table. She explained that she and her colleagues had been analyzing the mission parameters and believed they had identified a viable approach to the problem. Nancy joined her, spreading additional weather charts across the table and pointing to specific data points that indicated brief windows of opportunity. Her analysis suggested that the storm system followed predictable patterns, creating short periods when visibility and wind conditions would be manageable for skilled pilots flying carefully planned routes. Maria added her technical assessment, outlining modifications that could be made to aircraft engines and navigation systems to improve their reliability under extreme conditions. Her recommendations were based on mechanical principles that most pilots didn't fully understand, but her track record of keeping damaged aircraft operational spoke louder than theoretical knowledge. The room fell silent as the implications of their proposal became clear. These three women were volunteering for a mission that experienced male pilots had declared impossible. They were offering to risk their lives to save soldiers they had never met, flying through conditions that had already claimed multiple aircraft, carrying supplies that could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of people. General Tunner found himself confronting a choice that challenged every assumption about military aviation, gender roles, and the nature of courage itself. The official regulations were clear about women's exclusion from combat missions, but the Burma situation was unprecedented. The trapped soldiers were running out of time, and conventional solutions had proven inadequate. The general looked at each of the three women in turn, seeing in their faces the same determination that had driven the most successful pilots under his command. He recognized the quality that separated true aviators from mere airplane drivers.
The willingness to accept responsibility for impossible situations and find ways to succeed where others had failed.
Outside the briefing room, the monsoon rain continued to fall, and 500 American soldiers waited for rescue that might never come. Inside the room, three women stood ready to rewrite the rules of war, one flight at a time. The decision that would determine their fate hung in the air like the storm clouds gathering over the mountains of Burma, heavy with possibility and danger in equal measure. The silence in the briefing room stretched for what felt like hours but lasted only minutes. General Tunner's weathered face showed the weight of command as he processed the unprecedented proposal before him. His entire military career had been built on following established procedures and respecting chain of command, but the Burma situation demanded solutions that existed outside normal parameters. The lives of 500 soldiers hung in the balance, and conventional wisdom had already proven inadequate. Colonel Harrison was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived countless combat missions. He pointed out that these women, regardless of their flying skills, lacked combat experience and had never flown the hump route under optimal conditions, much less during a monsoon. His concerns were practical rather than prejudicial. The mission would require split-second decisions in life-or-death situations, and theoretical knowledge was no substitute for experience earned through survival. Lieutenant Colonel Zhang supported Harrison's assessment while adding his own concerns about aircraft performance under extreme conditions. The C-47 cargo planes would be loaded beyond normal capacity with medical supplies, ammunition, and emergency food rations. Flying overweight aircraft through violent storms would require physical strength and endurance that had never been tested in female pilots over extended periods. The mission would take 12 hours of continuous flying through some of the most demanding conditions in aviation. Captain Thompson raised questions about navigation and communication protocols that had been developed specifically for the hump route. These procedures had evolved through trial and error, often written in the blood of pilots who had discovered what worked and what proved fatal. The women might possess excellent flying skills, but the Burma mission required knowledge that came only from experience with the unique challenges of Himalayan aviation. Sarah listened to each objection with the patient attention of someone accustomed to having her capabilities questioned. She responded by pulling out a folder containing detailed flight logs from her civilian flying experience, which included crop dusting in severe weather, emergency medical evacuations, and test flights of experimental aircraft. Her total flight hours exceeded those of many combat pilots, and her safety record was perfect across thousands of hours of challenging flying conditions. Nancy countered the navigation concerns by producing meteorological analyses that demonstrated her understanding of Himalayan weather patterns in greater detail than any pilot in the room. She had spent months studying the unique atmospheric conditions created by the world's highest mountains, developing theoretical models for predicting wind patterns and storm movements that had proven accurate in other challenging environments. Her knowledge was academic, but it was also comprehensive and precise. Maria addressed the mechanical concerns by describing modifications she had already implemented on other aircraft to improve their reliability under stress. Her engineering background allowed her to understand aircraft systems at a level that surpassed most pilots, who typically relied on mechanics to handle complex technical issues. She could diagnose and repair problems in flight, potentially saving missions that would otherwise be lost to equipment failure. General Tunner weighed these arguments against the stark reality of the situation in Burma. Weather reports continued to indicate that conditions would remain dangerous for at least another week, and intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were moving to exploit the isolation of the trapped American unit. Every day of delay increased the likelihood that the rescue mission would become a recovery mission, searching for bodies rather than saving lives. The general made his decision with the calculated precision that had made him one of the most effective logistics commanders in the Allied forces. He authorized the mission with specific conditions designed to minimize risk while maximizing the chances of success. The 3 women would fly as a unit, with experienced male navigators assigned to each aircraft to provide backup for the complex route finding required over the Himalayas. Radio communication protocols would be modified to provide constant contact with base operations, and emergency contingency plans would be developed for every conceivable scenario. The preparation phase began immediately, with ground crews working through the night to modify aircraft and load supplies. The C-47 planes were stripped of all non-essential equipment to reduce weight while maximizing cargo capacity. Additional fuel tanks were installed to extend range, and backup navigation equipment was added to provide redundancy in case of primary system failures. Each aircraft received fresh engines and propellers, with every mechanical system checked and double-checked by teams of experienced technicians. Sarah spent the pre-flight hours studying detailed maps of the Burma region, memorizing landmarks and emergency landing sites that might be used if weather conditions forced an early termination of the mission. She practiced emergency procedures until her responses became automatic, understanding that split-second decisions in crisis situations would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. Her preparation was methodical and thorough, reflecting the discipline that had kept her alive through thousands of hours of dangerous flying. Nancy worked with meteorologists to develop hour-by-hour weather forecasts for the entire route, identifying optimal timing for each phase of the mission. Her analysis indicated that a narrow window of improved conditions would open approximately 6 hours after dawn, lasting just long enough for the round trip to Burma if everything proceeded according to plan. The margin for error was minimal, but the opportunity was real and measurable, according to her calculations. Maria supervised the final mechanical preparations, personally inspecting every critical system on all 3 aircraft. She identified potential failure points and developed contingency procedures for dealing with common mechanical problems at high altitude in severe weather. Her attention to detail was exhaustive, reflecting her understanding that mechanical failure during the mission would likely prove fatal for aircrew and doomed soldiers alike. The night before the mission, the 3 women gathered in the deserted mess hall to review their plans one final time. The weight of responsibility was evident in their serious expressions as they discussed communication procedures, emergency protocols, and contingency plans for every scenario they could imagine. Their conversation was professional and focused, but underneath the tactical discussions was an unspoken recognition of the historic significance of what they were attempting. They were not just trying to save 500 soldiers trapped in Burma. They were proving that women could perform the most dangerous military missions with the same skill and courage as their male counterparts. Success would open doors that had been closed throughout military history, while failure would reinforce prejudices that had kept women on the sidelines of military aviation. Dawn broke grey and threatening over the airfield, with monsoon clouds building on the horizon like artillery shells preparing to explode. The 3 modified C-47 aircraft sat on the runway like sleeping giants, loaded with supplies that represented hope for the soldiers waiting in Burma. Ground crews completed final checks while meteorologists provided updated weather reports that confirmed Nancy's predictions about the brief window of opportunity. General Tunner arrived at the flight line as the women completed their pre-flight inspections, his presence a visible reminder of the command authority that had made this unprecedented mission possible. He spoke briefly with each pilot, offering final encouragement while reinforcing the importance of following safety protocols and maintaining communication with base operations. Sarah climbed into the cockpit of the lead aircraft with movements that reflected thousands of hours of flight experience. Her hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency as she completed the startup sequence, bringing the powerful engines to life with a roar that echoed across the airfield. The sound carried a promise of power and reliability that would be crucial during the challenging hours ahead. Nancy settled into the pilot's seat of the second aircraft, her eyes already studying the weather patterns visible through the windscreen. The storms building over the mountains looked formidable, but her analysis indicated they contained pockets of stability that could be navigated by pilots who understood atmospheric dynamics. Her confidence was based on scientific knowledge rather than wishful thinking, and her preparation had been thorough enough to account for variables that others might miss. Maria's aircraft was loaded with the heaviest supplies, including ammunition and medical equipment that would be crucial for the trapped soldiers. Her mechanical modifications had been designed to handle the extra weight while maintaining the performance characteristics necessary for high-altitude flying in severe weather. The engines sounded strong and steady as she brought them to full power for the final pre-flight checks. The radio crackled, with clearance for takeoff, as the 3 aircraft moved into position on the runway. General Tunner watched from the control tower as they began their takeoff roll, knowing that the next 12 hours would determine whether his unprecedented decision had been brilliant or catastrophic. The fate of 500 soldiers, the careers of 3 pilots, and the future of women in military aviation, all balanced on the outcome of this single mission. The aircraft lifted off into the storm-darkened sky, their engines growing distant as they climbed toward the mountains that had defeated so many other pilots. Behind them, they left an airfield full of people who had watched them depart with mixtures of admiration, concern, and hope. Ahead lay the most dangerous air route in the world. 500 soldiers who needed rescue, and the chance to prove that courage and skill were not limited by gender or prejudice. The 3 aircraft climbed steadily into the threatening sky, their engines synchronized in a rhythm that spoke of precision and determination. Sarah's lead aircraft cut through the increasingly turbulent air as they approached the foothills of the Himalayas, where the real challenges of the mission would begin. The weather reports had been accurate about the timing of conditions, but no amount of preparation could fully capture the reality of flying through a monsoon storm system at 15,000 feet above the world's highest mountains. The first wave of turbulence hit them like a giant fist, tossing the heavily loaded aircraft around the sky with violent unpredictability. Sarah fought to maintain altitude and heading while her navigator, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, called out compass readings and checked their position against the maps spread across his small table. The instruments were jumping wildly as electrical activity from the storm interfered with their navigation equipment, forcing them to rely on visual landmarks and dead reckoning techniques that had been used since the earliest days of aviation. Nancy's aircraft, flying 500 feet below and slightly behind the lead plane, was experiencing even worse conditions as it encountered the wake turbulence from Sarah's passage through the storm. Her meteorological training had prepared her for the theoretical aspects of flying in severe weather, but the reality of being thrown around inside a metal tube while trying to maintain precise control was testing every limit of her endurance. Her hands gripped the control yoke with white-knuckled intensity as she fought to keep her aircraft stable enough for accurate navigation. Maria's heavily loaded aircraft was struggling most with the violent air currents, the extra weight making it sluggish to respond to control inputs, while simultaneously making it more vulnerable to sudden wind shifts. She was monitoring engine temperatures and fuel flow with constant attention, knowing that the severe turbulence was putting extraordinary stress on every mechanical system aboard her plane. The modifications she had made during the preparation phase were proving their worth, but she could hear subtle changes in engine rhythm that suggested they were operating at the very edge of their design limits. Radio communication between the aircraft was intermittent and crackling, with static as lightning strikes nearby created electromagnetic interference that rendered their equipment nearly useless. Sarah was maintaining formation primarily through visual contact, keeping Nancy and Maria in sight, while navigating by reference to mountain peaks that appeared and disappeared through the swirling clouds like ghosts in a fog bank. The route they were following had been flown successfully by other pilots, but never under conditions this severe. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air became thinner and the weather more violent. Ice began forming on the aircraft surfaces, adding weight while reducing lift and threatening to clog essential air intakes. Sarah activated the de-icing systems while monitoring airspeed and altitude carefully, knowing that ice accumulation could quickly transform a manageable situation into a fatal crisis. The heating systems were working at maximum capacity, but they were fighting a losing battle against the sub-freezing temperatures at altitude. Nancy was using her meteorological knowledge to identify patterns in the storm that might indicate clearer air ahead. The clouds around them were displaying characteristics that suggested they were passing through the most intense part of the weather system, with the possibility of improved conditions on the other side of the current storm cell. Her analysis was being confirmed by subtle changes in air pressure and wind direction that indicated they were approaching the edge of the most violent atmospheric activity. Maria was dealing with a developing mechanical issue that could potentially end the mission before they reached Burma. One of her engines was running rough, with cylinder head temperatures climbing toward dangerous levels despite her attempts to manage the problem through power adjustments and mixture control. She was faced with the choice between turning back immediately or continuing with reduced power in hopes that the engine would hold together long enough to complete the mission. The decision to continue was made easier by radio communication from the trapped soldiers in Burma, whose increasingly desperate situation was being relayed through military communication channels. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were closing in on the American position, and ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were critically low, with wounded soldiers dying from injuries that could be treated if proper equipment were available. Every hour of delay increased the likelihood that the rescue mission would arrive too late to save lives. Sarah made the command decision to continue despite the mechanical problems and severe weather, accepting increased risk in exchange for the chance to save lives. Her experience as a civilian pilot had taught her that calculated risks were often necessary to achieve important objectives, and the Burma situation clearly justified extraordinary measures. She communicated the decision to Nancy and Maria through hand signals visible through the aircraft windows, receiving acknowledgement that they were prepared to continue regardless of conditions. The navigation challenge was becoming increasingly complex as traditional landmarks disappeared beneath solid cloud cover, and electronic navigation equipment continued to malfunction due to electrical interference from the storm. Sergeant Rodriguez was using dead reckoning techniques combined with periodic glimpses of mountain peaks to estimate their position, but the margin for error was growing larger with each mile they flew through the deteriorating conditions. Nancy was supplementing the navigation effort by using her understanding of weather patterns to predict where they might find breaks in the cloud cover that would allow visual confirmation of their position. Her meteorological knowledge was proving invaluable as she identified atmospheric conditions that typically occurred near specific geographic features, providing additional reference points for navigation when traditional methods were inadequate. Maria was managing her engine problems through careful power management and constant monitoring of all engine parameters. Her mechanical intuition told her that the engine would likely hold together long enough to reach Burma, that the return trip would require either repairs or engine replacement that might not be possible at their destination. She was prepared to accept the risk of being stranded in Burma rather than turn back while soldiers were dying from lack of supplies. The three aircraft pressed deeper into the storm system, their engines straining against winds that seemed determined to push them back toward their starting point. Lightning strikes illuminated the clouds around them in brilliant flashes that revealed the massive scale of the atmospheric violence they were challenging. Thunder crashes were audible even over the roar of their engines, and the smell of ozone filled the cockpits as electrical activity reached levels that threatened to damage their remaining electronic equipment. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, the weather began to show signs of improvement, exactly as Nancy's meteorological analysis had predicted. The violent turbulence gradually decreased to manageable levels, and breaks appeared in the cloud cover that allowed them to confirm their position through visual reference to known landmarks. The improvement was dramatic enough to suggest that they had successfully navigated through the worst part of the storm system. Radio communication was gradually improving as they moved away from the most intense electrical activity, allowing the three pilots to coordinate their approach to the Burma landing zone. Intelligence reports indicated that the improvised airstrip where they would land was barely adequate under normal conditions, with the monsoon rains having turned the surface into a mixture of mud and standing water that would challenge even experienced pilots. Sarah began her descent toward the target area while studying the terrain below for signs of the landing strip that had been carved out of jungle terrain by the trapped soldiers. The coordinates provided in their mission briefing were approximate at best, and finding the exact location would require careful observation of the ground while maintaining enough altitude to avoid ground fire from enemy positions that might be nearby. Nancy and Maria followed in formation as they broke through the cloud layer and saw the Burma landscape spread below them like a green carpet marked by rivers and clearings that looked tiny from their altitude. The landing strip, when they finally located it, appeared barely long enough for their heavily loaded aircraft, with tall trees at both ends that would make the approach particularly challenging. The sight of signal fires marking the landing zone confirmed that they had found the right location, and radio contact with the ground forces provided final confirmation that the trapped soldiers were still alive and desperately in need of the supplies the three aircraft carried. The mission was entering its most dangerous phase, as landing on an improvised strip in enemy territory would require precision flying that left no margin for error. Maria's engine was still running roughly, but her instruments indicated it would likely hold together long enough for landing and a quick turnaround. The mechanical problems that had threatened the mission were manageable for the immediate future, though the return journey would present new challenges that would test both her flying skills and her engineering knowledge. As the three aircraft aligned for their approach to the muddy landing strip carved from Burma jungle, 500 soldiers waited below for salvation that depended entirely on the skill and courage of three women who weren't supposed to be flying combat missions at all. The approach to the improvised airstrip looked like a controlled descent into chaos. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, Sarah could see the landing zone carved out of dense jungle, its muddy surface pocked with craters where enemy mortars had found their mark during previous attempts to resupply the trapped American forces. The runway, if it could be called that, was barely 800 feet of cleared ground flanked by towering trees that rose like green walls on either side of the narrow corridor. Signal fires burned at both ends of the strip, their smoke rising in thin columns that provided the only reliable indication of wind direction in the turbulent air that swirled around the mountain valley. The soldiers below had used pieces of parachute fabric to mark the best approach path, white cloth strips tied to makeshift poles that stood like desperate prayers against the overwhelming green of the jungle canopy. Radio crackles from the ground brought the voice of Colonel William Harrison, the commanding officer of the trapped unit, whose situation report painted a picture of desperation barely held in check by military discipline. Enemy forces had been probing their perimeter for 3 days, testing defenses that were rapidly weakening as ammunition supplies dwindled to critical levels. Medical casualties were mounting, with wounded soldiers dying from injuries that could be easily treated if proper supplies were available. Sarah began her final approach with the precision that had kept her alive through thousands of hours of dangerous flying. The approach angle was steeper than normal to clear the trees at the runway threshold, requiring her to maintain careful control of airspeed and descent rate while compensating for wind gusts that threatened to slam her aircraft into the jungle canopy. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant James Peterson, called out altitude and airspeed readings while scanning the instruments for any sign of trouble. The landing itself was a controlled crash rather than a graceful touchdown. The muddy surface grabbed at the aircraft wheels like quicksand, threatening to flip the heavily loaded plane before Sarah could regain control. The propellers threw up sheets of muddy water that obscured visibility completely for several terrifying seconds while she fought to keep the aircraft straight and prevent it from sliding sideways into the trees that lined both edges of the narrow strip. Nancy's approach was even more challenging. as she had to contend with the wake turbulence and mud spray created by Sarah's landing while dealing with her own aircraft control problems. The meteorological conditions in the valley were creating unpredictable wind patterns that bounced aircraft around the sky like toys in a hurricane. Her touchdown was harder than planned, but she managed to maintain directional control and bring her plane to a stop just short of the signal fire at the far end of the runway. Maria's landing was complicated by her ongoing engine problems and the deteriorating condition of the landing surface, which had been churned into an even worse mixture of mud and standing water by the passage of the first two aircraft. Her approach was slightly long, forcing her to use maximum braking and reverse thrust to stop before running out of runway. The rough-running engine coughed and backfired as she reduced power, but it continued to operate despite the mechanical stress of the violent landing. Ground crews of soldiers emerged from camouflage positions along the runway edges like ghosts materializing from the jungle itself. They were muddy, exhausted, and clearly running on determination rather than physical strength. But their efficiency in unloading the aircraft spoke to training and discipline that had kept them functional despite impossible circumstances. Medical supplies were the first priority, followed by ammunition and communication equipment that would allow them to coordinate with rescue forces. The soldiers moved with urgent efficiency born of desperation, understanding that every minute the aircraft remained on the ground increased the risk of enemy attack. The landing strip was well within range of Japanese artillery positions, and the sound of aircraft engines had certainly attracted unwanted attention from enemy forces who had been trying to eliminate the trapped American unit for days. Sarah supervised the unloading of her aircraft while scanning the surrounding jungle for signs of enemy movement. The dense vegetation provided perfect concealment for hostile forces, and intelligence reports indicated that Japanese patrols had been operating in the immediate area. Her aircraft was loaded with ammunition and medical supplies that represented the difference between life and death for the soldiers. But it was also a valuable target that enemy forces would be eager to destroy. Nancy was working with the unit's communications officer to establish radio contact with headquarters while her aircraft was being unloaded. The portable radio equipment they had brought would allow the trapped unit to coordinate with rescue forces and provide intelligence about enemy positions. Her meteorological knowledge was also being put to use as she briefed the ground commander about weather patterns that might affect future supply missions or evacuation attempts. Maria was examining her problematic engine with the help of the unit's chief mechanic, Sergeant Frank Mueller, whose improvised repair techniques had kept various equipment functional despite the lack of proper tools or spare parts. Together they identified the source of the engine problem as a fouled spark plug that could be cleaned and adjusted using available materials. The repair would improve engine performance for the return flight, but it would take precious time to complete. Colonel Harrison gathered the three pilots in a hastily prepared briefing area, where he provided an update on the tactical situation that explained why their supply mission was so critically important. Enemy forces had been systematically tightening their encirclement of the American position, cutting off escape routes and establishing artillery positions that could devastate any attempt at ground evacuation. The supplies delivered by the three aircraft would allow the trapped unit to hold their position until larger rescue forces could be organized. The intelligence briefing revealed that Japanese forces had been monitoring Allied radio communications and were aware that supply missions were being attempted. Enemy fighter aircraft had been positioned to intercept future supply flights, and anti-aircraft weapons had been moved into positions that would threaten aircraft approaching the valley. The return flight would face dangers that hadn't existed during their inbound journey. Sarah made the tactical decision to depart as quickly as possible, while weather conditions still favored their escape from the valley. The longer they remained on the ground, the more time enemy forces had to organize an attack on their position. Her aircraft had been unloaded and was ready for takeoff, but Nancy and Maria were still completing their resupply operations. The sound of distant artillery fire provided an ominous reminder that enemy forces were closing in on the American position. Mortar rounds were beginning to fall in the jungle around the perimeter, creating explosions that shook the ground and sent debris flying through the air. The enemy had apparently decided to risk a major assault, while the supply aircraft was still vulnerable on the ground. Nancy's aircraft was finally unloaded, but her engines were having difficulty starting in the humid conditions and thin air of the high-altitude valley. Moisture in the electrical system was causing ignition problems that required repeated attempts to achieve successful engine start. Each failed attempt increased the risk of being caught on the ground during an enemy attack. Maria's engine repair was completed just as the first enemy mortar rounds began falling near the airstrip itself. The improved engine performance would be crucial for takeoff, with the reduced power available at high altitude, but the artillery fire was forcing an immediate departure regardless of mechanical readiness. Sergeant Mueller wished her luck as she climbed back into the cockpit while explosions erupted in the jungle nearby. The takeoff sequence was conducted under fire, with enemy shells creating fountains of mud and debris along both sides of the narrow runway. Sarah's aircraft was first to depart, using maximum power to clear the trees at the end of the strip, while tracer rounds from enemy machine guns created streaks of light through the air around her plane. Her escape was successful, but it drew concentrated fire that would make departure even more dangerous for the following aircraft. Nancy's takeoff was delayed by a final engine start problem that required precious seconds to resolve while mortar rounds walked closer to her aircraft position. When her engines finally caught and she began her takeoff roll, enemy fire was so intense that her aircraft was hit multiple times by small arms fire. She managed to become airborne despite damage to her tail surfaces and a fuel leak that would limit her range for the return flight. Maria's departure was the most dangerous, as enemy forces had had time to concentrate their fire on the departure end of the runway, where aircraft were most vulnerable during the critical seconds of becoming airborne. Her takeoff run was through a wall of tracer fire and exploding shells, but her aircraft cleared the trees successfully despite taking hits that damaged her radio equipment and hydraulic systems. The three aircraft climbed away from the valley under continued fire from enemy positions, their mission accomplished despite conditions that had challenged every limit of their skill and courage. Below them, 500 American soldiers possessed the supplies they needed to continue fighting, but ahead lay a return journey through weather that might have worsened, and skies that could contain enemy fighters waiting to complete the destruction that ground forces had failed to achieve. The most dangerous part of their mission was just beginning as they turned toward home through storm clouds that concealed both salvation and destruction in equal measure. The return flight began as a desperate race against time, weather, and enemy forces that had been alerted to their presence by the artillery exchange at the Burma airstrip. Sarah's aircraft climbed steadily through the humid air, her engines running smoothly despite the stress of the dangerous landing and takeoff under fire. Behind her, Nancy's damaged aircraft was trailing fuel and struggling to maintain altitude, while Maria's plane was fighting hydraulic problems that made control increasingly difficult. Radio communication between the three aircraft was sporadic due to damage sustained during the ground attack, forcing them to maintain formation through visual contact, while navigating by reference to landmarks that appeared only briefly through the swirling monsoon clouds. The weather system had intensified during their time on the ground, creating conditions even worse than those they had encountered on the inbound flight. Nancy's fuel leak was creating a visible stream of aviation gasoline that sparkled in the grey light filtering through the storm clouds, marking her aircraft's path through the sky like a trail of liquid diamonds. Her fuel consumption calculations indicated that she had enough fuel to reach friendly territory, but the margin for error was shrinking with each mile they flew through the headwinds that had developed during their absence. Maria was dealing with multiple mechanical problems that would have grounded her aircraft under normal circumstances. The hydraulic failure was making control inputs sluggish and requiring constant attention to maintain level flight, while electrical damage was causing instrumentation failures that made navigation increasingly difficult. Her mechanical intuition was being tested to its limits as she compensated for systems that were operating far outside their design parameters. The three women had successfully completed the supply mission that male pilots had declared impossible, but their survival depended on reaching friendly airspace before enemy fighters could intercept them or mechanical failures could force them down in hostile territory. Intelligence reports had warned about Japanese fighter patrols in the area, and their damaged aircraft would be easy targets for enemy pilots operating from well-equipped airfields. As they climbed toward the altitude necessary to clear the Himalayan peaks on their return route, the air became thinner and the mechanical problems more severe. Nancy's engines were struggling to produce full power in the thin air, while simultaneously dealing with fuel flow problems caused by her damaged fuel lines. The combination was creating a performance deficit that made it increasingly difficult to maintain formation with the other aircraft. Sarah made the tactical decision to reduce their airspeed to help Nancy's damaged aircraft keep up, accepting increased exposure to enemy interceptors in exchange for keeping their formation intact. Her experience as a civilian pilot had taught her that mutual support was essential in dangerous situations, and abandoning a damaged aircraft was not an option regardless of the additional risk it created for the entire formation. The weather conditions over the mountains had deteriorated to near impossible levels, with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour at their cruising altitude and visibility reduced to nearly zero by dense clouds and precipitation. Lightning strikes were occurring constantly, creating electromagnetic interference that knocked out their remaining navigation equipment and forced them to rely entirely on dead reckoning and visual references that appeared only briefly through breaks in the storm. Maria's hydraulic problems were becoming critical as they approached the highest mountain passes on their route. The system was losing pressure steadily, making control inputs increasingly heavy and unresponsive. She was using manual reversion techniques that required tremendous physical strength to maintain level flight, and her endurance was being tested by the constant struggle against controls that fought her every attempt to maintain course and altitude. Nancy's meteorological knowledge was proving invaluable, as she identified atmospheric patterns that indicated slightly less violent conditions in specific areas of the storm system. Her analysis allowed Sarah to adjust their route to avoid the worst turbulence while maintaining general progress toward their destination. The modifications to their flight path were subtle but significant in terms of aircraft survivability and crew endurance. Radio contact with their home base was impossible due to atmospheric interference and damaged communication equipment, leaving them completely isolated as they fought their way through conditions that challenged every limit of human skill and mechanical reliability. They were flying entirely on their own resources, with no possibility of rescue or assistance if their situation deteriorated beyond their ability to manage. The first break in the clouds came as they crossed the main ridge of the Himalayas, revealing clear air and improving weather conditions on the other side of the mountain range. The sight of sunshine filtering through scattered clouds was like a promise of survival after hours of fighting their way through atmospheric violence that had tested their aircraft and their courage to the breaking point. Nancy's fuel situation was becoming critical as they began their descent toward friendly territory, with her fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels that might not be sufficient to reach their destination airfield. Sarah immediately began calculating alternate landing sites while scanning the terrain below for emergency strips that might accommodate their formation if they were forced down short of their intended destination. Maria's hydraulic system finally failed completely as they approached the final navigation checkpoint before their home airfield, leaving her with no power assist for any of her flight controls. Flying the heavy aircraft using manual reversion required every ounce of her physical strength and flying skill, but she maintained formation despite the tremendous workload imposed by the control difficulties. The approach to their home airfield was visible through clearing weather that seemed like a miracle after the hours of flying through impossible conditions. Ground crews were standing by with emergency equipment, having monitored radio reports about the damaged aircraft and prepared for the possibility of emergency landings that might require immediate medical attention and aircraft recovery operations. Sarah's landing was smooth and professional, despite her exhaustion from the long flight through dangerous conditions. Her aircraft touched down normally and rolled to a stop in front of the operations building, where General Tunner and his staff waited to debrief the returning pilots. The successful completion of her portion of the mission was evident in the relief and satisfaction visible on her face as she shut down her engines. Nancy's approach was more dramatic, with her damaged aircraft trailing fuel vapor and struggling to maintain stable flight characteristics due to the damage sustained during their departure from Burma. Her landing was harder than normal, but she managed to maintain control and bring her aircraft to a safe stop, despite the mechanical problems that had plagued the entire return flight. Maria's landing was a testament to pure flying skill, as she brought her aircraft down safely despite having no hydraulic assistance for any of her controls. The touchdown was firm but controlled, and her aircraft rolled out normally despite the tremendous physical effort required to maintain directional control without power steering or power brakes. The three aircraft were immediately surrounded by ground crews and medical personnel who had been standing by for their return. Initial damage assessments revealed that all three planes had sustained battle damage and mechanical problems that would have been considered mission-ending under normal circumstances, but the skill and determination of their crews had brought them home successfully. General Tunner approached each pilot personally as they climbed from their aircraft, his expression showing a mixture of relief, admiration, and recognition of what they had accomplished. The mission had succeeded beyond his most optimistic expectations, proving that women could perform the most dangerous military aviation missions with skill and courage equal to any pilot in his command. The intelligence reports that came in over the following days confirmed the critical importance of their mission. The supplies they had delivered had allowed the trapped American unit to repel a major enemy assault and maintain their position until a full-scale rescue operation could be organized. The 500 soldiers they had saved would go on to participate in operations that played crucial roles in the eventual Allied victory in Burma. The official records of the mission were classified immediately, with the participation of women pilots being deemed too sensitive for public release during wartime. Sarah, Nancy, and Maria received no public recognition for their heroism, and their names were omitted from the official accounts of the rescue operation that appeared in military histories. But among the pilots and aircrew who knew the truth about what had happened over Burma, the story of three women who had accomplished the impossible became a legend that would inspire future generations of aviators. They had proven that courage, skill, and determination were not limited by gender, and their example would eventually help open military aviation to women who would follow in their footsteps. The war would continue for 2 more years, but the precedent established by their successful mission had changed something fundamental about military aviation. The barriers that had seemed insurmountable before their flight to Burma had been broken by 3 women who refused to accept that anything was impossible when lives depended on their courage. Years later, when the stories could finally be told, the rescue mission would be remembered as one of the most heroic flights in aviation history, accomplished by 3 pilots who weren't supposed to be there at all, flying through conditions that had defeated everyone else, saving 500 soldiers who would have died without their intervention. Their legacy lived on in every woman who wore pilot's wings, in every barrier that was broken by someone who refused to accept limitations, and in the knowledge that true heroism has no gender, no prerequisites except courage, and no limits except those imposed by people who lack the vision to see what is truly possible when necessity meets determination in the crucible of war.